Okay, I just want to start this lecture by giving you some guidelines for the databases. I do have a lecture on databases posted, but I think that it's pre this particular website because Delgado upgraded its website since I made that last video. So it might be confusing if you're trying to access the library. Some of you might already know if you're a Delgado regular. But otherwise, if you go to the academics tab at the top of the home page, the DCC home page, then you'll see that there's a link to the library. You'll click on that. If you're off campus and you want to search for information, you're going to have to log in, and that login should be your Delgado email and PIN. And then once you land on that page, God, they've actually streamlined this because you used to have to click into things like 4 times. So now you're just right there where you can start to search. You can search the catalog, and so if you're nearby campus and you don't mind going and picking up print sources, or you find some online sources through the catalog, that's fine too. Then there's the databases, which I like to use, and you can use search them based on subject. You don't have to limit yourself to the databases that I'm going to point out. You might find some that are more appropriate for your topic, but I do find that a good go-to is the Academic Search Complete. And another one that's useful is the Opposing Views. So if you just click the O, it'll take you to the O section, and then there's the opposing viewpoints. Some people have found, there's a business one that's pretty good. Yeah, the Business Source Complete, some students have found that one pretty helpful as well. So the databases are useful because there are a lot of online sources available to you, and they just help sift. You can really do advanced searches and sift the information that way, so you're not having to look at 7,000 things that don't have anything to do with your topic. So the rest of my lecture about databases can be applied, even though the pages look different and everything, the search options will still work the same way. So you might watch that if you're having any trouble. I know some of you were talking about using local libraries. That's fine too, although I find that local libraries can be kind of limiting, whereas college libraries have access to a lot more texts. And that is part of what your tuition pays for, so I highly recommend that you take advantage of that. All right, for the rest of this lecture, I'm going to be talking more specifically about using sources, not just in the annotated bibliography, though that is part of this, but then sort of how this all matters to the research paper itself. And this is the lecture about synthesizing sources, really, like doing the research and synthesizing sources. So I had mentioned synthesizing sources a little bit earlier, or synthesis, in the strategies for analysis and argument lecture that's posted in one of our previous week's modules. So if you missed that lecture, go back and listen to it. This one, I'm just starting, it's sort of a playful title here, that thinking about sources as the bones of our paper, and that in the research process, we want to make sure that we're sucking out all that good marrow that we can get. But essentially, this is a lecture about evaluating sources, and a lot of the material from this lecture comes from both Purdue's Online Writing Lab and also sections 53 and 54 of your Rules for Writers text. So we really, when we're looking at sources, we want to make sure that they're both credible and relevant. So we should choose sources that have authors who are experts on the topic. We should choose sources that are current. We can use older sources if they're relevant to the purpose of the paper. For example, if you need to establish some kind of historical context or a timeline for change, that would be fine if you're using an older source. But sources should really be current. And then sources should also develop the ideas that are implied by your keyword searches. So when you type in technology and medicine, you don't want to just use sources that contain those keywords, but that are actually saying something relevant about that particular topic. Some hints for saving time. You might review the bibliographic citations of sources that are sort of relevant. If you find one source that seems really interesting and important, if you look at that, the bibliography or the work cited for that source, it could lead you to other sources that you might find beneficial for your own paper. And always you kind of want to do a quick eval on the front end before you spend a whole lot of time reading a source. Make sure that you know the author's information. A lot of times in the databases, there will be a summary of the source, and so you can check the summary of the source or the abstract. This will give you a better sense of the source's content before you invest time in reading it any further. And then the source's timeliness, so of course the date of publication, where is it located, where was it published. By location, that's like, is it at the library, is it online, are you going to be able to get to it quickly? And then also you can look at the keywords that are listed alongside it. Often when you pull up the source, there'll be categories associated with it, and so that's also a helpful way to figure out how valuable the source will be before you undertake the task of reading. A few notes on print sources versus internet sources. Print sources tend to go through a more extensive publication process. At the very least, they go through editing and review. If you're looking at a peer-reviewed source that's in an academic journal, typically an expert has written it, and then it has been evaluated by equal or like additional experts in that field, and usually all the information has then been verified by other people who are not the author. But even popular sources, so magazine articles, newspaper articles, those get edited, and they're always typically read by an editor and not just published directly by some schmo on the internet. And usually most of the time print sources will indicate authorship. If there's no clear author, no person taking credit for the work, there will be an organization usually that the work is affiliated with. And then typically authors will be affiliated with organizations as well. And then it's usually a little bit easier to access the date of publication with print sources. However, there are some really valuable online sources. So again, this is just making sure that you're using your brain when you sift through all the information. Remember Dave Chappelle and what he tells us about the internet. It can be gross, so we do need to watch out for grossness, because anyone with a computer can publish on a website or can create an online document. This is also, excuse me, why we need to be careful with Wikipedia. I really don't want to see Wikipedia counted as one of your sources for the research paper. It's not a bad place to begin to get a sort of base sense of information, but you shouldn't be citing Wikipedia in your college research paper. It's one of those online documents that can be edited by anyone. Some pages are really well documented, and so the information that we're getting has been sort of reviewed and supported, and we can look at the original sources from which the information came. Other pages, not so much. So if anything, you could use it as a starting point, and you can look at specific sources that were used to create the wiki, but then you need to look at those specific sources and cite those specific sources and not the Wikipedia page. The other thing is that with some online sources, especially if you've just done a Google search, authorship and affiliations might be difficult to locate. The same thing with dates of publication, especially because with the internet, you can publish something and then 5 days later go back and edit. And so we just don't it's sometimes more difficult to find the concrete information that we need for a works cited page. This isn't to say that you can't use internet sources. You just need to pay very close attention to where you're getting them from. If you're citing a government website that's giving you statistics about something that's relevant to the purpose of your paper, that's fine, because you're going to be able to cite the government organization as the author of the text. So some entity is taking credit for that work. It's not a mystery. Well, it's not too much of a mystery anyway where the information is coming from. Also, most traditional publications will clearly provide external sources of information. So that means that you can usually access where the other information came from. So especially in peer-reviewed journals, extensive bibliographies are usually provided. Also, it's fairly easy to determine the bias. And what I mean by that is that usually an author has a bent, a perspective, and so we want to make sure that we're aware of it. It doesn't, just because a writer has a bias doesn't mean we can't use the work. We just need to be aware that a perspective isn't the same thing as like a statistic or a fact. And so we don't want to cite someone's bias as some kind of concrete evidence. The same way we might use a statistic or a fact to support what we're saying. All right. And sometimes the purpose of an online text can be deceiving. So you just want to make sure that you're evaluating. And if you can't find an author, if you don't know who's published this information or why it's been published, then you should probably steer away from that source. And then finally, I think this is probably the most important point, that a lot of times we might get an author's name, but we have no idea what those authors' qualifications are. So I think a lot of news sites are kind of like that now, because there are so many people just starting up sites that are, some of them I don't even know. They're just like reposting stuff that's already been posted. And there might be a name and like a little picture of the person, but we have no idea what their qualifications are. Like, are they an expert on this topic, or are they able to just, blog from home? I don't know. So you want to just really watch out for that. In general, I would say that print sources are better, though I think that there's effort like Google Scholar, which I mentioned in a previous lecture. That's going to filter things so that you're getting more reliable information. So if you used Google Scholar as one way of accessing information, that would be acceptable. Although I do really encourage you to use the Delgado Library databases and the library catalog as a means for finding your sources. You're going to need the publication information, the date of publication, the publisher, the author, the editor. Those things will be necessary to your works cited pages. So you want to make sure that you're writing that stuff down. Or if you are using, this is another benefit of using the library database, is that you can email to yourself. If you find a source, you're going to notice that there are some tools, and one of those tools is being able to email a link to the source to yourself. Well, when you go to send that email to yourself, you can set it so that you're also sending yourself an MLA citation. And I walk you through that process in the library database video that's on the composition resources page in the MLA and research folder. So if you're lost and you don't know how to do that, you can go there. You could also contact a librarian via the chat option on the library website to get some assistance with that. All right, annotating the sources. So I'm sort of being repetitive here with dialogue, but essentially that's what you're doing. You are having a dialogue with these sources. And so you should constantly be asking yourself questions as you read and marking, if you can, the source itself, or at least taking notes in a notebook or on a computer. But I advise, if there is a preface to the source, that you read it, because that's going to establish what the author wants to accomplish. You should browse the table of contents and the index to get an overview of the source. This is especially useful if you are looking for specific information within that source. If you have a book, like, you don't have time to read an entire book unless it really interests you and you make time for it. But sometimes only a single chapter is relevant to what we want to talk about. So look at the table of contents, look in the index. If your topic's not really covered in depth, then you can move on to another source. Also, determine the intended audience for the source's intended audience, the writer's intended audience. So think about things like tone, style, the level of information. Is it really complicated and sophisticated information? Is it pretty simplistic? And what are the assumptions that the author makes about their reader? So here you're going to use those skills of rhetorical analysis that you used when you analyzed the Vayner video resume and this Michael Cera parody. You want to apply those same skills here as you evaluate the sources that you might use for your annotated bibliography and your research paper. So be careful, beware of propaganda. You could, of course, use propaganda if that's part of your purpose. If you're trying to analyze it, break it down, look at how it works. I think there's kind of a lot of propaganda in regard to the internet, getting us to use the internet, and we feel like, you know, we're safe using the internet, even though like we're totally being spied on. So if you're doing internet privacy as your topic, you could definitely analyze the propaganda, but you don't want to confuse that with a source that you're trying, you know, if you're citing propaganda as some kind of valid source, then you've got to be careful. Also, do you think the source offers enough evidence? Is the coverage of the topic comprehensive? Is the language objective or emotional? Okay, so the more emotional it is, probably the less likely you are to use it. There should be some objectivity. The writer should have some self-awareness. If it's nothing but a big fat appeal to pathos, it's probably not really suitable for the purposes of your paper. And then also watch out for other types of logical fallacies, so broad generalizations that overstate or oversimplify the issue at hand. Okay. I think it's a good idea when you can to print out the sources that you're using, so that way you can actively engage with them by writing on them, circling them, highlighting them, that sort of thing. I realize that sometimes this isn't possible. Some of the longer sources you might not want to print, but you can make a PDF that you could then edit. So there are options for keeping track of your sort of conversation with the text as you are reading and evaluating it in terms of your paper. Further questions to consider: does the author use a good mix of primary and secondary sources? So does the author use solely somebody else's research, or does the author can have research of his own, studies of his or her own that have been conducted to support the purpose of the writing? If the source is largely opinion, is the author supporting that opinion with sound reasoning? If not, again, ditch it. If the source is not accurate, and sometimes you'll know because you're reading something and you're like, nope, that doesn't sound right. You might, though, if you have any skepticism about a source, do some cross-checking just to verify information, make sure it's valid. If you're seeing that same information show up in several places, and they're all like they're reputable sources, then that's probably going to show that the information is valid. Again, timeliness is important. Okay, if the source is like 50 years old, why are you using it? This is the other thing about using the local library, that sometimes what's on the shelf is really out of date because libraries aren't funded properly, so they can't keep up with everything. And so you really want to watch out for sources that are just too old to really be relevant. So again, consider why you're using them. And really, you shouldn't have too many sources that are ancient. Also, just how credible is the author? If the document is anonymous, what do you know about the organization? There has to be someone or some organization taking credit for the information. Otherwise, I would advise that you move on to another source. And then make sure that you check the list of references or other citations that look as if they will lead you to other related material that will be good for supporting your own ideas or for just developing your own ideas on the topic. Again, looking at those bibliographies can be really useful, and it can be a huge time saver. All right, so summarizing and paraphrasing sources. We want to make sure in the blurbs for the bib, that you don't commit plagiarism. Okay, so you're going to do mostly summarizing of these sources, and so you want to read and annotate, have your conversation with the text, and then put the text away. And then in a few sentences, your own words, explain the main idea of the source. And then go back and look at the source and verify that you didn't sort of through osmosis accidentally write exactly what was in the text. Most of the time, if you give yourself some space and then you sit down and you just don't look at the source, but you just write a summary, you won't commit plagiarism. But you do want to just double check that you haven't accidentally used any direct language or committed a faulty paraphrase where the sentence structure is really the same and all you did was plug in synonyms, because that's still plagiarism. Make sure that you keep that you record page numbers for the summary. So if you are looking at a book or any kind of source that has page numbers associated with it, you will need to cite those page numbers, even if you're summarizing. If it's a general summary of the whole text, you don't have to worry about it. But if you are, say, using a book and you're only going to be using a certain chapter, then your summary should have a citation for the page numbers for that chapter that you're referring to. All right, so some things to keep in mind when you're paraphrasing. And when you're summarizing and paraphrasing. Summary is getting the big picture down in your own words. So you're getting across the general ideas of the text. Paraphrase is more specific than that. And you're using roughly the same number of words that the author used, but you need to use completely different words and completely different sentence structure. And I go over this in more detail in an MLA lecture that's on that composition resources page in the MLA folder. So if you're worried about committing plagiarism, check that out, because it, like I said, it just goes over it in more detail and gives you examples. Also, Rules for Writers is a really great resource for that too. They give you several examples of faulty paraphrase and then how to correct the problem. Okay, so basically both your word choice and your syntax, meaning the ordering of your words, must be different than those that are presented in the original source. And of course, because you're offering up specific ideas from specific parts of the text, even though it's in your own language, you still need to use parenthetical citations when page numbers apply. All right, finally, quoting is going to become much more important to the research paper itself. In the bibliography, you probably won't quote that often, okay? Because the goal of the bibliography is really to focus on summarizing the sources and then explaining their value to your overall thesis statement. Whereas in the research paper, that's where you're actually going to cite the specific information from the source to develop and support your own ideas, okay? So while quoting is not necessary in the annotated bibliography, you might want to quote an apt phrase or a specific statement from the author if it's relevant to the summary that you're making or if it's relevant to your evaluation of the source. So you should keep a document or a notebook somewhere of quotations that you think you might like to use in your paper. One of the things, and this is again goes back to the sort of theme of this lecture, or the little title of the lecture, that sources are bones. I find when I'm doing a researched essay that it helps me a lot if I take all the passages from the texts that I want to use. So I'm going to type up all my quotes that I think I want to use in one document. And then I use that as kind of the structure. These are now the bones of the essay, and I have to fill in the muscle and the flesh that links these bones together and then makes the essay a whole working body. And by doing this, a couple of things happen. One, I get the sort of grunt work of having to transcribe the quotations from one text into another text over with. So I get all my quotes in. I get it all transcribed. I set up my parenthetical citation. So I get those page numbers in there. I get the author's last name and page numbers into those parenthetical citations. And then all I have to do now is think about the organization of the quotes, and it's really easy to move things around. So if I start thinking about, okay, I want to talk about this idea first, and so I need to use these two sources to do that. And I start rearranging the evidence from the sources according to the presentation of ideas. So I'm using them to kind of outline my paper, and then I write my way from, one quotation to another, essentially. But I think that helps me. That doesn't work for everybody. But I do think by getting the grunt work out of the way, the nitty gritty of MLA, which is the citation part of it, it takes your mind off of having to worry about that, and you can just focus on what it is that you're trying to say. And then you can always amend your quotations, edit them accordingly as you arrive at them in your writing process. All right, so I do encourage you, if you haven't already, to look at the other MLA guideline lectures. I believe they refer to the handbook as a writer's reference. That's the old version that we used to use. It's the same book. The only thing that's different is that the section numbers are not the same. But if you just go to the MLA section of your Rules for Writers, you will easily be able to find everything that you need for quoting and paraphrasing and summarizing. All right, so again, use the techniques that I've discussed in this lecture to evaluate your sources and make the most of your research efforts. And then think about the sources as bones over which you will lay the muscle of your own thoughts. And then how will you arrange them to form the skeleton of your paper? And then you'll have to put in, of course, the muscle to add the muscle of thought. But I do recommend that approach. Many students have found that helpful in the past, especially for a paper of the length that you're expected to write. All right, so that's the end of that. If you have any questions, of course, as always, please don't hesitate to contact me.